For millennia, the grand pyramids of Egypt have towered over the desert sands. Everything about the great ancient civilization that once ruled the lands remained a mystery. That is until July 19, 1799. A French soldier discovered a large stone about 35 miles east of Alexandria during Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian expedition. He unearthed a written language that had been dead for thousands of years. The translations would prove it to be the key to unlocking the secrets of an entire civilization. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. This is what Herodotus, the father of history, said. The Nile is the lifeline, providing Egypt with water for the cultivation of crops. This led to the burgeoning of civilization along the Nile Valley. The river strip that divided the Egyptian territory into two parts provided a favorable environment for the rise of civilization. When the Nile Valley began in the Miocene times, cutting it into its current shape, the various geographical resources contributed to the state's foundation. The Nile's annual floods effectively contributed to the state's foundation. Over the centuries, mud deposits built up when the water receded and flowed along its banks. This made Egypt one of the first agricultural communities in human history. At the end of the Paleolithic era, there was a widespread production of arrows, harpoons, corn, sewed skins, boneworks, and pottery. Carbon-14 tests also demonstrate this. Researchers demonstrated that corn was harvested in a Neolithic silo on the edge of the Nile between 4,600 and 4,250 BC. Later, people built shacks and huts out of reeds and solid mud and sowed corn on the muddy soil of the Nile marshes. Ancient Egypt was divided into two territories, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Lower Egypt lay to the north, where the Nile extended out with its several branches to form the Nile Delta. Upper Egypt, which stretched to Aswan, was to the south. The two kingdoms were united around 3000 BC by King Narmer, but each retained its regalia. The head jet or white crown was for Upper Egypt, and the dash red or red cross town was for Lower Egypt. As a result, the pharaohs were known as the rulers of the two lands. They were the Shint, a double crown, with each half denoting sovereignty of a different land. Pre-dynastic Egypt. The pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt is the period preceding documented history, encompassing around 6000 to 3150 BCE from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic age, and on to the founding of the first dynasty. There are no written records from this period, but archaeological digs in Egypt have unearthed items that convey their tale of the Nile River Valley's cultural history. The pre-dynastic period is called by the regions or ancient city sites, where these artifacts were discovered, not the cultures that lived there. The health and culture thrived in the area between Egypt and Nubia around 30,000 BCE. This gave birth to the Kaden and civilian cultures around 10,000 BCE. Then came the Harathan culture. All of these cultures are hunter-gatherer societies that gradually grew more sedentary and settled into more permanent settlements based on agriculture. The Thiam Oasis is a natural basin located southeast. The Giza Plateau was home to the Thiam civilization from 9000 to 6000 BCE. These people lived near a vast lake and made their living through agriculture, hunting, and fishing. The people of Thiam constructed reed homes with subterranean basements for food storage. Cattle, sheep, and goats were domesticated, and basketry and pottery production flourished during this period. Tribal chieftains assumed positions of power, which may have been passed down to the next generation. The next generation in a family, or tribal unit communities, went from tiny tribes traveling together to large groupings of diverse tribes living in the same region all the time. The Thiam culture gave rise to the Marimde. During 5000 to 4000 BCE, which was named from artifacts discovered at the location of that name, on the western side of the Nile Delta. The majority of Egyptians were farmers, and agriculture was the basis of the dynastic Egypt economy. Farmers relied on the annual summer floods. It is clear that the first Egyptian farmers were hunter-gatherers. They planted crops such as wheat, lentils, barley, flax, and peas, in addition to herding animals. The oldest levels of Marim di Beni Salama evolved between 8000 and 4000 BC. They date back to the Neolithic era, and the Nile Valley's convex terrain encouraged their development. The Nile Valley's convex terrain encouraged the development of several basins that were flooded with floodwaters every year. These basins, which have been found to number 130, served as the irrigation system's reservoirs in ancient Egypt. Granaries were made of clay jars or baskets that were buried up to their necks in the earth. The Elomari culture, which developed around 4000 BCE, built circular homes of higher complexity with plastered mud. All of these cultures evolved and flourished in Lower Egypt, Northern Egypt, the closest to the Mediterranean Sea. The inhabitants of the Badarian culture lived in movable tents like their ancient forefathers, but preferred fixed homes. Following the Badarian period came the Amrician period, also known as Nakata. The first Amrician constructed more complex homes with windows and hearths, waddling dab walls and windbreaks around the main entryway. The practice of mummification began around 3500 BCE. The process of mummification began around 3500 BCE, where burial items were still left with the deceased. These developments were aided by the Gursian culture, also known as Nakata II, which launched trading with other regions. This inspired changes in culture and art. The houses were built of sun-baked brick, and the more opulent ones included courtyards. This addition would become commonplace in Egyptian homes. Later, the city of Abydos was located. North of Nakata, an important burial location emerged, with huge tombs forming a necropolis, a city of the dead. These tombs were originally made of mud bricks, but subsequently, huge, needly hewn limestone was used. Eventually, this site became the burial place for Egypt's rulers. Despite this evidence, it is clear that individuals from all across the nation had their deceased buried at Abydos and gave burial gifts to commemorate their memory. By this time, the cities of Zois and Hierapolis were ancient, while Venus, Nakata, and Nekhen were rapidly developing. The hieroglyphic alphabet, invented around 3400 to 3200 BCE, was used for maintaining records. No entire sentences from this period have been discovered, but the earliest Egyptian writing discovered so far originates from Abydos and was discovered on pottery, clay seal imprints, and bone and ivory items. Complete sentences are not found in Egypt until the time of King Parib. In the Second Dynasty, 500 years later, this period led to the Nakata. The third period from 3200 to 3150 BCE followed Nakata III. This was the early dynastic period, and Egypt's recorded history began with commerce. Communities expanded and flourished, and the populations of both Lower and Upper Egypt increased. Small villages of brick dwellings and buildings evolved into bigger urban centers that soon clashed. Most likely this was for trade products and water resources. The thinnest, Nakata, and Nekhen were the three principal city-states of Upper Egypt during the period of thinness. It seems clear that Nekhen defeated Nakata before absorbing Nekhen. These battles were fought between the Scorpion kings, whose identity is unknown, and others, most likely Ka and Arma. According to some researchers, Scorpion Dafin, Scorpion II, and Ka were the final three rulers of the proto-dynastic period before King Narma invaded and unified Lower and Upper Egypt and created the first dynasty. This is the early dynastic period. One more dynastic period in Egypt began in the years 3150 to 2613 BCE. This marks the beginning of the country's historical era, in which Upper Egypt, the south, and Lower Egypt to the north were unified as one country under centralized authority. The divine rule of the monarch started, and a distinct Egyptian culture emerged, including the development of writing, arts, and sciences. The first king of Egypt was a ruler of Upper Egypt, presumably from Phoenix or High. Rincopolis, a ruler of Upper Egypt, defeated the other city-states around him before conquering Lower Egypt around 3150 BCE. He married the princess Nathotep of Nakata in an arrangement to enhance the links between the two towns. He undertook military operations in Lower Egypt to quell revolts and expand his territory into Canaan and Nubia. He sponsored massive construction projects, and urbanization developed throughout his reign. His son Horahar-Nama is assumed to have succeeded him. In 3100 BCE, he continued his father's military expansion and increased trade. He was notably interested in religion and the concept of the afterlife. It was under his reign that the Mustaba tomb was built. Toraha was replaced by his son Juror in 3050 BCE. His son Jet married Princess Merief around 3000 BCE. He is considered to have taken leadership of the nation after his death. It is uncertain whether she governed as a regent for her infant son Den or as queen. However, her reign is notable for being the first time a woman is recorded governing in ancient Egypt. She is regarded as the greatest monarch of the first dynasty and reigned for 50 years. Her reputation as an efficient monarch stemmed from her economic advances, military conquests, and the stability of her rule, as proven by expensive construction projects and elaborate works of art. Art is the first monarch to be represented wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, showing that he ruled over a unified nation. He was succeeded by two additional monarchs, Nejib and later Samarakat. Both had tough reigns marked by insurgency. The dynasty ended with the cause of reign, during which his heirs struggled for the throne and were defeated by Hotep Sekhemwi, who established the second dynasty. Internal strife and a lack of or misunderstanding over the records of the second dynasty are incomplete. None of the second dynasty monarchs have reliable dates, and several of the king's names appear to be repeats of earlier rulers. Hotep Sekhemwi, for instance, means two powerful ones at peace. This is a prime illustration of the issue because his name implies that he came to power after subduing the princes who fought for the throne after Ka. However, his name is inscribed on the entrance to Kwa's tomb, implying that he was the ruler responsible for burying Kwa. This tomb implies that he was the ruler responsible for burying Hua. He already had that name before the succession war broke out. Hotep's second wife is credited with bringing peace to Egypt upon his ascension to the throne. However, a brief instability and rebellion marked his reign. Ranab, also known as Nibra, was the first to link his name to that of the gods and create a bond between the monarch and the divine. There is no reasonable explanation for Parazim. Early academics claimed that he was the first monotheist to declare Set to be the sole deity. However, evidence of his reign disproved this because his name is only found in Upper Egypt. It's possible that he allied with Set for political reasons to distinguish himself from the Horus religion of Lower Egypt. Regardless, he is regarded as a good monarch because commerce, the economy, religious practice, and the arts all thrived during his reign. Reign for Ribson was replaced by Case Kimwi, probably his son, who continued his predecessor's construction projects and is believed to have brought Egypt's two regions back under central control, or at least reinforced unification. His most famous works include the statues at Hierapolis and Abydos, as well as his role as the father of Pharaoh Djoser, Third Dynasty. The Egyptian Third Dynasty starts with King Djoser, best known for his step pyramid at Saqqara, Maneto's timeline. It is unclear when he ruled during the Third Dynasty. His name is only known from the Abydos monarch list, the Turin Papyrus, and two releases discovered in the Mustafa tomb number K2 at Beit Khalaf Djoser. He erected so many monuments that historians have long assumed his tenure extended at least 20 years. He started military campaigns to Sinai and kept Egyptian unity, resulting in the stability required for his construction projects. Joseph's step pyramid at Saqqara is Egypt's first recognized pyramid, designed by his architect, Vizier Imhotep. Imhotep was a vizier, sage, architect, astrologer, and chief minister under Joseph. He was the second pharaoh of Egypt's third dynasty and was later deified and worshipped as the god of medicine in Egypt and Greece. He was associated with the Greek deity of medicine, Asclepius. He is thought to have designed the step pyramid in Memphis's Saqqara necropolis, which has 6 steps and is the world's oldest surviving stone monument. An inscription carrying his name on a statue of Joseph, uncovered near the Saqqara pyramid site, attests to Imhotep's high status in Joseph's court. The inscription includes titles such as the leader of the sculptors and the chief of the seers. Historical documents depicting Egyptian society and medicine throughout the Old Kingdom demonstrate that the main magician of the time was Imhotep. He designed the step pyramid in Memphis's Saqqara necropolis. This pyramid, with 6 steps, is the world's oldest surviving stone monument. An inscription carrying his name on a statue of Joseph was uncovered near the Saqqara pyramid site. It attests to Imhotep's high status in Joseph's court. The inscription includes titles such as the leader of the sculptors and the chief of the seers. Historical documents depicting Egyptian society and medicine throughout the Old Kingdom demonstrate that the main magician of the pharaoh was Imhotep. The step pyramid started as a basic mastaba monument with a flat top and sloping sides, similar to many previous dynasties' tombs. However, the architect Imhotep had bigger plans for his king's eternal dwelling. The step pyramid is a succession of mastabas piled on top of each other, with each step slightly smaller than the one beneath to create a pyramid shape. Earlier mastabas were made. The step pyramid was made of stone slabs with carved motifs of trees and reeds. When finished, it stood 62 meters tall, making it the tallest building of its period. To deter robbers and secure the king's corpse and burial goods. The real chambers of the tomb were dug beneath the foundation as a maze of passageways with rooms off the hallways. However, this strategy did not work because the tomb was robbed of all of its valuables. The king's corpse was robbed of all its valuables, including the foot in antiquity. Nevertheless, the step pyramid's design and construction epitomized the genius and vision of the Third Dynasty builders, who would later raise the buried pyramid and the layer pyramid, among many other structures and sanctuaries. These early visionaries established the foundations for the later true pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, which have mesmerized and captivated people for millennia. The Old Kingdom of Egypt is also known as the Age of the Pyramids, or the Age of the Pyramid Builders, because it contains the great Fourth Dynasty, during which King Sneferu mastered the craft of pyramid construction, and the pyramids of Giza were built under the reign of Khufu and Menkaure. The historical documents of this time, the 4th to 6th dynasties of Egypt, are sparse. Historians consider the history of the era as literally written in stone and mainly architectural in. It is clear that academics have been able to build a history through the statues and their inscriptions. The pyramids themselves provide little information about their architects, but adjacent funerary shrines and steles provide the king's names and other significant information. Carvings in stone discovered elsewhere during the period document different events and the dates on which they happened. Finally, the mausoleum of the 5th dynasty's last monarch, Unas, contained the first pyramid texts, detailed drawings and writings inside the tomb that cast light on the religious views of the period during the Old Kingdom of Egypt are clear. The elite standardized art and figures were produced uniformly to reflect the tastes of Memphis, the capital. Other art forms such as painting and literature exhibit more skill in the Old Kingdom. Statues from the late early dynastic and early Old Kingdom periods are very comparable. The Old Kingdom's most famous works of art are the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx of Giza, both of which remain today. Smaller structures were crafted with the same precision. Egyptians placed great importance on Old Kingdom art and architecture in later ages, despite the fact that all levels of society may have shared the same religious systems. Social inequality persisted even after death. The only significant impediment to reaching an afterlife was being buried outside of Egypt. Egyptians believed that to be reborn, they needed to be buried in Egypt if they died abroad. Relatives went to tremendous pains to bring their bodies back for burial, so that those correct funerary rituals could be performed and they could be buried. In their native land, they could enter the afterlife to coordinate the labor force that constructed the pyramids at Giza and elsewhere during this time. Unprecedented bureaucratic efficiency was needed, and this bureaucracy could only function under a powerful central authority at the top of the pyramid that it represented Egyptian society. The monarchs stood at the top of the pyramid, and they were granted ownership of all of Egypt by the gods, at least in theory. The literate and illiterate classes were divided in the Egyptian social structure. The literate class was the ruling class, comprising a small fraction of the population, was the main criteria for determining the character of ancient Egyptian society. Individuals were frequently more important than the positions they held. The king established the scope of bureaucratic power, and effective administration depended on the same pool of literate aristocrats. Without them, the king could not govern. We will state some of them as follows. The role of the vizier was established as early as the early dynastic period. The vizier, who can be assimilated into a form of prime minister, was assigned a response possibility to other members of the court. He sent communications through scribes and managed the military, regional governors, and public works projects, among other things. The last king of the Third Dynasty was thought to have initiated the massive building projects of the Old Kingdom by constructing the Midam Pyramid. However, credit for the Great Pyramid goes to Sneferu. The first king of the Fourth Dynasty, Sneferu, began the Old Kingdom's golden era with the construction of two pyramids. The first was the Pyramid of Meda, also known as the False Pyramid. Its shape resembles a tower more than a pyramid, and its exterior casing is surrounded by a massive mound of gravel. The second was the Pyramid of Sneferu, also known as the Pyramid of the Sun, Egypt's first real pyramid, but it did not last. This is because changes were made to Imhotep's initial pyramid design, causing the exterior casing to sit on sand rather than rock, which caused it to fall. The Crooked Period and the Red Pyramid are Sneferu structures at Djoser, or North Pyramid. The Bent Pyramid gets its name from the fact that it rises at a 55-degree angle and then changes to a 43-degree angle of smaller stones, giving the impression of marble. The workers had finished the base and sides before realizing that a 55-degree angle was too steep, and changing their plan to conclude the job as best they could. Sneferu grasped the issue and went on to construct his third pyramid. Sneferu was a ruler, unafraid of loss or sorrow. When the Bent Pyramid failed to satisfy his standards, he simply began work on the Red Pyramid, named after the use of reddish limestone. Limestone was used in the construction of the pyramid on a firm foundation for better stability. The Red Pyramid, 105 meters tall, was Egypt's first effective real pyramid. It was originally encased in white limestone, as were the other later pyramids, which crumbled away over time and were collected by locals for other construction projects. Following in the footsteps of Jose's complex at Saqqara, Sneferu had mortuary temples and the other structures built around his pyramids. Once the Red Pyramid was finished, priests oversaw day-to-day activities. This points to the stability of his rule, which he bequeathed to his son Khufu. When he died, the ancient Greek authors referred to Khufu as Chops. He's best known for his Great Pyramid at Giza. In their works, the Greeks portrayed him as a tyrant who oppressed the people and compelled them to labor for him against their will. This perception may have been created by the tales contained in the Westcar Papyrus. This is a compilation of 4 stories written about the kings of the 4th dynasty and found by Henry Westcar in around 1824 CE. The papyrus contains 4 tales recounted by Khufu's sons. One tale recounts how King Khufu summons a sorcerer who claims to be able to reconnect a decapitated head to a body. Some academics read his actions in requesting a demonstration as malicious or careless. The Westcar Papyrus, a compilation of 4 stories written about the kings of the 4th dynasty, was found by Henry Westcar in around 1824 CE. It contains 4 tales recounted by Khufu's sons, including one in which King Khufu summons a sorcerer who claims to be able to reconnect a decapitated head to a body. Some academics read his actions as malicious or careless, but this is a misinterpretation. During Khufu's reign, Egypt became even wealthier as a result of his military battles against Nubia and Libya, as well as his lucrative trade deals with cities such as Byblos. He also invested in agricultural innovations to improve the livelihoods of his people. During his reign, the world's first documented dam was constructed in Wadi Jarawi, a mountain range west of modern Helwan. This dam improved water availability for farms and others in the town. The Great Pyramid of Giza was also constructed during this period. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the final of the ancient 7 wonders of the world and a distinguishing emblem of Egypt. It is situated on the Giza Plateau near the modern city of Cairo and was constructed over 20 years during the rule of Khufu. Many hypotheses exist regarding the pyramid's purpose, but the most generally acknowledged idea is that it was built as a tomb for the king. However, how it was constructed remains a mystery to this day. Historians continue to dispute the idea of ramps going around the outside of the building, despite a growing body of evidence proving that the pyramid was constructed by the ancient Egyptians using technical means that were most likely common to them. These theories persist. The complexity of the interior passages, shafts, and chambers, as well as the nearby Osiris shaft, encourages the persistence of these fringe theories. The mystery of how the pyramid was built at all and its orientation to cardinal points also encourages the persistence of these fringe theories. A prominent figure during that time called Humayunu was the vizier during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty and one of the king's relatives. He was in charge of building his Great Pyramid and keeping an eye over its construction works. He was buried near Khufu's pyramid. The construction work of the pyramid was done by expert and unskilled laborers employed by the state for the job. These employees either offered to pay off a debt, performed community service, or were paid for their time. The annual inundation of the Nile River was crucial for Egyptian survival because it distributed rich soil from the riverbank all across the shores. However, it also made farming those lands impossible during the flood. During these times, the government supplied work for farms by constructing large monuments. These were the individuals who performed the real physical labor of moving stones, elevating obelisks, constructing temples, and constructing the pyramids that continue to amaze and motivate people today. Khufu was replaced by a family member outside the legal line called Judafra. After his death, Djedefre was Khufu's son, but he did not appear to be his designated heir. Some scholars believe Djedefre built the great Sphinx of Giza. Others believe Khofre, his sibling and successor, built it. The Sphinx is the world's biggest monolithic monument. It shows a recumbent lion's torso with a king's head and face. Historically, this king's face has been identified as Khofre's. However, Dobrev and others believe it's Khufu's. The Sphinx's face resembles Khofre more than Khufu. Khofre's pyramid is the second largest in Giza. His complex is almost as big as his father's. Little is known about his rule. According to Egyptian texts, he continued his father's, identified as Khofre's, but Dobrev and others believe it's Khufu's. It appears to have been constructed by Khofre because it is exactly in line with this pyramid complex, and the Sphinx's face resembles Khofre more than Khufu. Khofre's pyramid is the second largest in Giza, and his complex is almost as big as his father's. Little is known about his rule, but according to Egyptian texts, he continued his father's policies and government model. Khofre's policies and government model were defined by his concentration of power in the hands of his closest family members and his strict control over policies and laws. Following Godfrey's demise, succession was temporarily disrupted when Baka Djedefre's son took the throne. He did not even rule for a year before Menkaure Khofre's son took over his throne. Both the Greeks and the Egyptian writings praise Menkaure. He, like his father and grandfather before him, started construction. On his Giza pyramid and shrine complex, Menkaure's pyramid and complex are smaller than the other two, representing a significant development in the history of the Old Kingdom and one of the causes of its collapse. The resources required to construct the Great Pyramid were no longer accessible during Menkaure's period, but he did his best to establish an everlasting residence on par with his fathers and grandfathers. His son and designated successor perished while this pyramid was being constructed, upsetting the dynastic succession. The construction of the pyramid was a clear indication that the dynastic succession was being upset. Menkaure died before the pyramid complex was finished, despite reigning for 30 years. He was unable to finish the work of his predecessors, which many historians attributed to the dwindling resources at his disposal. Menkaure's successor finished the pyramid structure at Giza, but he was buried in a relatively modest mastaba at Saqqara. As previously stated, the monarchs diverted immense resources to their funerals. The construction of these structures and buildings was a royal affair, but the temples and sanctuaries were increasingly under the authority of the priests who managed them. The Giza Plateau is now an old, sand-swept location on the outskirts of Cairo. It was once a city of the deceased, inhabited by the living, who tended to it during Menkaure's time. Giza had priests' houses, shrines, worker accommodations, stores, factories, breweries, and all the amenities of a small metropolis. Ancient Egyptian society was vibrant and active. The lowest social class consisted of peasant farmers who did not own the land on which they worked or the houses in which they resided. The monarch, members of the court, and priests owned the land. Peasants would say, "Let us work for the nobility." Peasants were virtually always farmers, regardless of what other trade they practiced. They cultivated and harvested their crops, giving the majority to the landowner. Most kept part for themselves, and the ladies maintained their private gardens. While the men worked in the fields, the lowest stratum of society created the items utilized in commerce, allowing the civilization as a whole to survive. These peasants were also part of the workforce that erected Egypt's pyramids and other monuments when the Nile riverbanks overflowed. When farming became difficult, the men and women went to work on the king's projects. This labor was always rewarded, and there was no literary or physical. There is no doubt that any of Egypt's major monuments were erected by slave labor. The peasantry had no other way of improving their status than by working on these projects. Guild painters and engravers were in high demand in Egypt and were paid more than unskilled laborers who merely hauled stones for construction. Peasant farmers could also improve their status by learning a craft. Skilled carpenters could make a fortune by making tables, desks, chairs, beds, and storage chests. Skilled painters were needed to decorate upper-class dwellings, castellets, tombs, and monuments. Brewers were held in high regard, and breweries were occasionally controlled by women. They appear to have been operated by females in early Egyptian history. Beer was the most popular beverage in ancient Egypt. It was commonly utilized as a kind of recompense 3 times a day. Workers on the Giza Plateau were given a beer ration. The deity Osiris was said to have provided the drink to the people. Breweries were overseen by the goddess Tenon. Marriages were more secular than religious in ancient Egypt. Parents planned the majority of weddings in any of the classes. Girls were often married at the age of 12 and boys at the age of 15. Royal offspring were frequently promised to foreign monarchs as babies to seal treaties. The ancient Egyptians lived lives that were not all labor. They found plenty of time to have fun by participating in sports, board games, and other activities. These included hockey, handball, archery, swimming, tug-of-war, gymnastics, rowing, and a sport known as water jousting. This was a sea battle played in small boats on the Nile River. In it, a jouster tried to knock the other out of his boat while the second team member maneuvered. The ancient Egyptian sports were all distinct festivals, each with its own drinking and feasting traditions. The Egyptian diet consisted mostly of grains, wheat, and vegetables, with meat being incredibly expensive and only affordable to royalty. The 4th dynasty ended with Shepsikov's brief reign, and the 5th started with much less hope. The 5th dynasty is known as the Sun King's dynasty because many of their titles contain the name of the deity Ra, usually given as Re. The first 3 rulers, Uzakov, Saur, and Kakai, would later be memorialized as divinely chosen in the Westcar papyrus tale. The birth of the kings marks the dynasty's beginning with King Uzakov. However, a lady named Kan causes a daughter of Menkora to appear prominently in Egyptian texts as the mother of 2 kings of Upper and Lower Egypt. It is unclear who these kings were. Monarchs were her monument is the 4th pyramid of Giza, and she was a significant person. There is much that is known about her. Uzakov is best renowned for his work on the Temple of the Sun and Abuser. This structure represents a significant divergence from the position of the monarch at the beginning of the 4th dynasty and the beginning of the end of Giza as the king's necropolis. The sun deity Ra was now venerated directly by the people through the priesthood, and the king's position as the god's primary representative were reduced. Userkov's son Sahir replaced him and constructed his funerary complex at Abu Sir near the Temple of the Sun. Sahira was a capable monarch who led the first Egyptian expedition to Punt and arranged significant trade treaties with other countries. Punt was one of his biggest accomplishments as it became an important source of many of Egypt's most valuable resources. In time, it was regarded as a legendary country of the gods. As a legendary country of the gods, he constructed his own temple to the sun in Abu Sir and was the first to use the palma form of columns in building, which would later become the norm for columns throughout Egypt. His military exploits and cautious resource management enriched the nation, as demonstrated by the intricate work done on his mortuary complex and the inscriptions discovered. His son, Neferu Kakai, succeeded him. Inscriptions suggest he was a good king and well-regarded, but little is known of his tenure. We know very little about his tenure except that the priesthood gained even more power during his rule. His son Nefer-Efre succeeded him, but he died young, possibly around the age of 20. He was followed by King Shepsakar, who was succeeded by the new seer Ini. The priests of Ra acquired even more authority during his rule, and the bureaucracy of the temples and mortuary buildings grew as well, putting a burden on royal offerings, which paid for sanctuary care and maintenance. He was the last monarch to construct a temple to the sun. Djedkarisi replaced him in the late 25th to mid-24th century BC. Djedkarisi's roots are unclear. He's not regarded as Menkahorakayu's son, but he may be connected to keeping the economy stable. He reformed the administration and the clergy extensively during his rule. Djedkarisi refused to. He continued the customary practice of erecting a shrine to the sun deity and decreased the number of clerics required to maintain funerary structures. He also arranged the second Punt expedition, which enriched Egypt and reinforced relations with Punt. However, the most important element of Djedkarisi's reign was the decentralization of the government in Memphis, which gave local authorities 30s more authority. Jennifer Isi was replaced by his son Unaz, the reign of whom is a little documented. Unis was the first Egyptian king. The king had his tomb decorated and inscribed with what became known as the pyramid texts. These inscriptions depict the king in communion with Ra and Osiris. The king's position was already considerably reduced when the 6th dynasty started. Local officials and bureaucrats built more elaborate tombs than nobles during the rule of the first monarch Tedi. Tedi was killed by his bodyguards, according to the 3rd century BC historian Manetho. This act would have been inconceivable earlier. He was replaced by Usurkure, who may have been involved in the assassination plan. His reign was brief, and he was followed by Merie Pepe I. During his reign, the nomarchs gained authority by the end of the Old Kingdom. The political power had fragmented, and the system was decentralized. The restoration of central power was a lengthy process that lasted well into the 12th dynasty because of the breakdown of central political authority. Political authority passed into the hands of the nomarchs, who took complete control. This pattern persisted during the reigns of Marin, who renamed himself the first and never cared about Pepe II, who ascended to the kingdom as a child and perished as an old man, signifying an incredible rule of nearly a century during Pepe II's lengthy rule. The Old Kingdom gradually crumbled, and the increasing influence of provincial nomarchs and the clergy eroded the central government and king's authority. Pepe II was followed by Miranda Nemtim Softekun with a very short reign. The dynasty ended with Neitchakar, identified by some scholars and Egyptologists as the Queen Natakris, from Herodotus's account of an Egyptian queen who avenges her brother's murder by drowning his killers at a banquet. Pepe II had outlived any heirs to the throne and appears to have been a pretty ineffective monarch in his final years. There was no effective central authority to react to the drought-caused famine in the country. The Old Kingdom ended. The 6th dynasty came to an end because no powerful ruler ascended to the throne to guide the people. Local authorities focused on their areas and lacked the means and motivation to assist the rest of the nation as the 6th dynasty died out. Egypt gradually descended into the first intermediate period. The central government at Memphis lost its power during the first intermediate period. The great structures of the Old Kingdom, such as the pyramids at Giza, were no longer constructed because there was no strong central sovereign to order and pay for them. There was also no administration to coordinate the large workforce. However, a study of historical data does not support the idea of a chaotic, dark era. Instead, it suggests a different social and political model than what had come before. There is some historical evidence for this. The claim of unrest and disorder stems from the absence of a single powerful central government. The country's different regions were essentially self-governing. The lack of information about the kings of the 7th and 8th dynasties attests to their ineffectiveness. Their identities and dates will be forgotten in Egyptian history. The ancient city of Memphis was abandoned at some time by rulers who saw themselves as the heirs of the Old Kingdom kings. The rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties seized Memphis as their center and declared themselves Egypt's real kings. The 0th dynasty seized Heracleopolis as their center and declared themselves Egypt's real kings in Tef. The Theban nomarch, who bore the customary epithets of Great Overlord of the Nome and Overseer of Priests, came to prominence around 2125 BC and opposed the authority of Heracleopolitan kings until the first established Egypt's 11th dynasty. During the Middle Kingdom, he was known as Intef the Mighty. A monument was erected in the Temple of Karnak in his honor, marking the beginning of a new era, the Middle Kingdom. He was the second menace who united Egypt and ushered in the Middle Kingdom period. He laid the road to unity, as his predecessor and successors, Mentuhotep Bayo and Mentuhotep II, did. The first, approximately 2115 BCE, followed in Tef's path and conquered the neighboring nomes for Thebes, considerably increasing the city's stature and strength. His initiatives were carried on by his predecessors, Mentuhotep II, who used these early victories to ultimately beat Heracleopolis and then punish those nomes who had stayed faithful to the old kings while rewarding those who had honored Thebes. Mentuhotep II devoted his time after the process of unity to the ruling military accomplishments and construction projects. Mentuhotep's successor, Mentuhotep III, reigned from 2010 to 1998 CE. He maintained and expanded his programs, dispatched an army to Pun, and strengthened the northern delta's borders. Mentuhotep IV replaced him. His entire 7-year rule is silent, but he most likely continued his predecessor's policies effectively because the nation is thriving. When a minimat replaces him as monarch, the nation is thriving. Minyan Mod was sent by Hotep Afir's vizier to quarry stones for the king's project. He had an inscription made of the extraordinary events he witnessed. First, a gazelle gave birth on the stone selected for the king's sarcophagus. This indicated that the stone had been chosen correctly because it was endowed with the Candidian life. Second, an unanticipated rainfall descended on the celebration, revealing a well big enough to water the entire gathering. The inscription was later interpreted to mean that a minimat was chosen by the god Odds to become king. The gods had allowed him to experience miracles, and he was the first to abandon Thebes for unknown reasons. He established his seat in court in Aitawi, south of Memphis. The first successor Sinneret, the first 1971-1926 BCE, improved the country's infrastructure and initiated the kinds of grand building projects that had characterized the Old Kingdom. The king's power was represented by a temple to the moon at Karnak, which sparked the construction of the great temple complex there. Amenemhat was the first king to follow in the footsteps of Intef II and Mentuhotep II by restricting the authority of local nomarchs and priests and giving power only to those most trusted in the family. Sinneret I continued the same strategy. The administration of the 12th dynasty was so effective that it kept wealth centralized with the monarch, while allowing for the development and prosperity of individual regions without allowing them to become too strong. Unlike the Old Kingdom, the king governed all of Egypt, but specific officers were rewarded for their devotion. The Egyptians developed various advanced ways of irrigation systems, and to keep track of the water levels, they built nilometers to gauge the height of the flue and to determine the tax levels. Canals were dug to provide water to different areas. The wealth was centralized with the monarch, while allowing for the development and prosperity of individual regions. The king governed all of Egypt, but specific officers were rewarded for their devotion. The Egyptians developed various advanced irrigation systems and built nilometers to gauge the height of the flue and determine the taxes levels. Canals were dug to provide water to different areas. When the second decided to turn the center into an agricultural center, he developed a specific irrigation system with a dike that transported water from Lake Morris, which resulted in crop prosperity in the area. He was also behind the construction of the White Chapel, a building important to historians and academics because it contains a record of all the nomes of the period. He transformed the Thiam area into an agricultural center by developing a specific irrigation system with a dike that transported water from Lake Morris. This led to a period of prosperity in the area. He was also responsible for the construction of the White Chapel, a building of great importance to historians and academics because it contains a record of all the nomes of the period. Senter was the first ruler to follow him, and he may have governed alongside him. This was unique to the Middle Kingdom, in which a younger man, usually a son, would govern alongside the king to learn the position and guarantee a seamless transfer of power. Scholars disagree on whether this practice was truly followed, but there is no question that it was followed by Menkaure and his successor, Senter. At the second, 1897-1878 BCE, double dates for two rulers on official cartouches indicate co-regency. Sennacherib II is known for his excellent ties with the regional authorities, which led to an improved prosperity of the nation. It's worth noting that during Sennacherib II's rule, local officials arrived just as they had at the end of the Old Kingdom, and this did not cause the kingdom the difficulties that it had previously. Sennacherib II was followed by Sennacherib III, the most potent monarch of the period, 1878-1860 BCE. Sennacherib II was a king who reigned during a period of great prosperity. He was deified during his lifetime and is remembered for his military advancement into Nubia and the rise in Egypt's riches and influence. Sennacherib III exemplified the Egyptian cultural value of military ability and quick action. He was the pinnacle of the warrior king and was thought to be unbeatable at the helm of his troops. His expeditions in Nubia widened Egypt's borders and the fortifications he built there. He erected fortifications along the border to facilitate trade. He also conducted an expedition into Palestine, which improved trade ties for that area. The ancient Egyptians built earth and stone barrages and dams, such as El Lan Dam, during the reign of King Amenemhat III, who ruled in the 12th dynasty. He wanted to make good use of the floodwaters for the irrigation system. To protect the state from destructive high levels of inundation water, early November was the time when preparations for planting season began. Fields were prepared for planting, irrigation facilities were repaired or cleared, and property lines were re-evaluated. Since the ancient Egyptians were known to document every detail of their daily life, we have seen the process of growing and harvesting, the grain depicted in great detail in various tomb paintings. Various crops were planted widely, which made food. Egyptians had plenty of grain to choose from, including amr wheat, which made bread and beer. They grew grapes for wine, dates, palm fruits, figs, sycamore, and papyrus, which they used to make paper-like scrolls for writing. They also made sails cords and mats from the plant. Farmers used various tools during the planting process, including a fascinating device called a shatif. It's a hand-operated device used to lift water from the river. The river consisted of a long pole with a bucket hung on a rope from one end, and the other end had a weight attached to it. It was used to fill jugs with water to transport them, or even to run water in small canals along ditches. It's normal for people to wonder how such a civilization in ancient times managed to erect huge buildings and move colossal statues without having the technology we have in the current modern world. Some scenes from tombs of high officials prove this. I have proof of how the whole process of moving huge statues was done. Jehun Act was a nomarch of the 12th dynasty. He used to govern the 15th nome of Upper Egypt. His tomb has a very interesting scene in it of the transportation of a roughly 6.8 meter high monument of him by 172 people using ropes in a slide, in an endeavor aided by the dumping of water in front of the slide. Unfortunately, no evidence of this exists. This colossus has never been discovered. Mother III did not achieve any major military victories, but he constructed almost as many monuments as his father. He was responsible for the vast mortuary sanctuary at Hawara, known as the Labyrinth. Amenemhat IV, who ruled from 1815 to 1807 BCE, replaced him and maintained his policies. He completed his father's construction tasks and began many of his own during his reign. He undertook numerous military and commercial expeditions. Trade thrived with towns in the Levant, particularly Byblos and elsewhere. The co-regency policy, if implemented, guaranteed a seamless transfer of power from ruler to ruler. However, it failed in the case of Amenemhat IV, who had no male successor to prepare for succession after his demise. The throne passed to his sister, or probably wife, Sobonefro, 1807-1802 BCE, whose rule is little known, unless the queen Nidokrat Natok. Sobonefru, the first woman to govern Egypt since the early dynastic period, was the ruler of the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. The 12th dynasty concluded when she perished without an heir, and the 13th started with the reign of Sobekotep. The Middle Kingdom's 12th period was the most powerful and wealthy, and the 13th dynasty would. The 13th dynasty received the riches and the policies, but they were unable to put them to good use. It seems that the 13th dynasty maintained the policies of the 12th dynasty monarchs and kept the nation united. However, none of them had the personal power of the previous kings. According to incomplete documents, Lower Egypt started to develop its political groups during the Second Intermediate Period. This era starts when the Egyptian rulers of the 13th dynasty relocated the capital from Et to Y. Thebes, the former capital of the late 11th dynasty in Upper Egypt, was weakened by this move. The first 1991-1962 BCE established the tiny settlement of Hudworth in the far north at the start of the 12th dynasty, which developed into a commercial hub with easy access to the sea and road paths to Sinai and the area of Palestine during the 13th dynasty. Effective trade and immigration were the result. The influx of Semitic people to Avaris ultimately led to the growth of a wealthy and powerful elite that gained control of the government. These individuals were known to the Egyptians as Heka Karset or Hyksos. The name of the Hyksos remains unclear, but many hypotheses have been proposed, including the possibility that they were refugees fleeing the Aryan invasion of Asia. However, this assertion has been debunked. The Egyptians refer to them as Asians, but this was a word used for anyone beyond the country's eastern boundary, from the Levant to Mesopotamia, during the late 13th dynasty. The Egyptian monarchs ceased supplying the border fortifications located in Nubia, and no additional soldiers were stationed there. The troops who were already stationed at the forts were never returned to Egypt, and the former garrisons became their permanent residence. These troops served as commerce intermediaries between the Egyptian city of Thebes and the kingdom of Kush. As the 13th dynasty neglected matters to the south, just as they did to the north, the kingdom of Kush developed into a centralized power with its capital at Kurma. Some of the ancient Egyptian fortifications along the border were destroyed at some point, presumably during an assault. What is evident is that as the Egyptian government and thieves disregarded Kush's influence in the south, Kush's power increased and the boundary became more flexible. The troops who had been left behind were no longer seen as a threat. The people of the region behind no longer saw it as their duty to protect against invasions. By this point, the monarchs documented for the latter portion of the 13th and 16th dynasties were non-Egyptians, or, at the very least, did not have Egyptian names. They are considered to be the rulers of the region. Their timeline is muddled, and some names are only known from ceremonial items. Some are known only from pieces of kings' lists, making dating problematic. The Hyksos achieved economic dominance of the eastern delta and then pushed north. They negotiated treaties and forged contracts with various governors of other districts in Lower Egypt until they had conquered a sizable amount of territory and could exert political authority. Once established in Avaris, the Hyksos elevated Egyptians to positions of power, adopted Egyptian customs and attire, and absorbed Egyptian deity worship into their own beliefs and ceremonies. The Hyksos monarchs established Egypt's 15th dynasty, but once they were evicted, the invading Thebans destroyed all traces of the Hyksos in Egypt. Only a few Hyksos rulers are known by name, thanks to the ruins of inscriptions and other texts discovered at Avaris and elsewhere. The best known is Pepe, also known as Apophis, who had an Egyptian name related to the giant snake, Apophis, or Apet the sun. At the same time, the Hyksos rose to prominence in northern Egypt. The Nubians rose to power in the south. The Middle Kingdom's 13th dynasty, like Lower Egypt, had forgotten to pay attention to its southern frontier. Thebes remained Upper Egypt's capital, but instead of dominating the entire nation, it was wedged between the Hyksos in the north and the Nubians in the south. According to Benito, a Hyksos, the Thebes were the ones who wrote to the Theban king Sakin and Ranta 15 AD BCE. They wrote about a hippopotamus pool to the east of the city, which prevented them from sleeping day and night. The message was most likely about the Theban practice of hippopotamus hunting, which would have been insulting to the Hyksos, who worshipped Set and included the hippo in their religious observances. Tao saw it as a challenge to his. Os wrote to the Theban king Sakin and Ranta in 15 AD. He demanded the destruction of a hippopotamus pool to the east of the city, as it prevented him from sleeping day and night. The message was most likely about the Theban practice of hippopotamus hunting, which would have been insulting to the Hyksos, who worshipped Set and included the hippo in their religious observances. Tao, rather than complying with the request, saw it as a challenge to his authority, autonomy, and marched on Avaris. His mummy indicates that he was slain in battle, and this, together with the events that follow, reveals that the Thebans were vanquished in this fight. Tawasan Kamos took up the cause, lamenting bitterly in an inscription about having to pay the Asiatics' taxes and dealing with outsiders to the north and south of him and his kingdom. He launched a huge attack on the Hyksos, destroying Avaris according to the narrative. Kamos reports that his attack was so fast and scary that it rendered the Hyksos woman barren, and that he destroyed the city to the ground following the carnage. This tale appears to be exaggerated, as the Hyksos retained control of Lower Egypt 3 years after Kamos's invasion, and Avaris remained the Hyksos' stronghold. Kamos was succeeded by his brother Amos, who, according to the inscriptions, drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and destroyed their metropolis of Avaris. These events are described in the tomb inscriptions of another man, Amos's son, Ibana, a soldier who fought under King Amos. Ibana describes the devastation of Avaris and the retreat of the remaining Hyksos to Sarawin and the Palestine region. Amos then besieged this city for 6 years until the Hyksos fled again, this time to Syria. What happened to them after that is unknown. He established the 18th dynasty and began the new kingdom of Egypt. He was the age of the Egyptian Empire. The Hyksos were responsible for the formation of a professional Egyptian army of conquest. He sought to ensure that no foreign nation ever gained such dominance in their land again. The triumph that would become the new kingdom is the legacy of the second intermediate period. The 18th dynasty of Egypt was established by Elmos I, who built some of the most renowned and memorable monuments since the Old Kingdom's pyramids and expanded Egypt's borders into a kingdom, the New Kingdom, foreign music. Almost the first realized that the Hyksos had been able to establish themselves so securely because previous Egyptian monarchs had permitted them. He chose to establish protected areas around Egypt's boundaries and fortify neglected settlements in strategic locations to protect the nation. The Battle of Amos marked the first clash between him and the Hyksos, thrusting him and his troops into contact with the areas of Palestine and Syria. He continued his operations there, while also conducting military excursions south against the Kingdom of Kush and Nubia. When he died, he had protected the nation and consolidated his authority, leaving a steady political and economic situation for his successor, Amenhotep I. Inscriptions from 1541 to 1520 BCE show that Amenhotep I followed in his father's footsteps. He modeled himself after his father as a warrior monarch, but he most likely only commanded battles in Nubia. There are no accounts of him conducting expeditions in Palestine or Syria. However, he may have done so because those areas stayed secure during his and his successors' reigns. Thutmose I, who ruled from 1520 to 1492 BCE, replaced him and immediately started wars to expand Egypt's reach. Thutmose I put down a revolt in Nubia. He immediately assumed the throne and murdered the Nubian monarch, suspending his corpse from the prow of his ship as a caution to other rebels. He then extended Egypt's control over Nubia further south. He shifted his focus to Palestine and Syria, expanding Thebes' famous Temple of Karnak and building numerous other temples and structures throughout Egypt. Most of the second 1492-1479 BCE succeeded him, but little is known about him. His rule was short-lived, eclipsed by his more potent half-sister, Shepsut. Shepsut ruled from 1479 to 1458 BCE, one of the most potent and effective New Kingdom rulers. Thutmose II had one child with her and another with a minor woman. Most of the third was named as a successor. Following Thutmose II's death, Shepsut ruled from 1458 to 1425 BCE. She was appointed regent of Egypt and officially co-ruled with Thutmose III. She had been the force behind her husband's tenure and continued to do so, as she saw fit after his death. She was in charge of numerous construction initiatives. She conducted the most successful expedition to Punt and added her works to the temple at Karnak. She governed in harmony with the south. Her construction undertakings were so beautiful and numerous that subsequent pharaohs claimed ownership of them. She was able to do so because Hatshepsut's name was taken from all of her structures, including her magnificent complex at Deir al-Bari around 1458 BCE. The obelisks erected in different temples were symbols of the sun god. Many of them can be found everywhere in the world, whether they were real Egyptian ones or modern ones imitating the ancient Egyptian obelisks. The process of carving one is not a paradox. The unfinished one, is located in the quarries of granite and Aswan. It was probably commissioned to accompany the Lateran obelisk, which was originally at Karnak but was later brought to the Lateran Palace in Rome. In 1458 BCE, it was a wealthy and secure country. It wasted no time in improving itself. It established the Egyptian Empire, which its descendants would sustain. It defeated the neighboring countries and expanded Egypt's dominion. He used the war chariot acquired from the Hyksos and his superior weaponry and strategies to lead at least 17 separate military campaigns over 20 years. Subduing kingdoms from Libya to Syria and extending Egypt's authority in the south from the region around Byblos down to Kyrgyz. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III ascended to power, believing him to be weak and inexperienced. The king of the Syrian city of Kadesh instigated a revolt in the Egyptian province of Canaan, which swiftly gathered support from other places, aiming to dethrone Egypt. Thutmose III marched his army from Thebes to Canaan and northern Syria, prudently choosing a narrow pass from the town of Aruna instead of the wider and easier routes to the city. He surprised his enemies by entering the Nile Valley behind their defensive positions and driving them from the field. The city of Kadesh instigated a revolt in the Egyptian province of Canaan, which swiftly gathered support from other places. This coalition met in the city of Megiddo. Thutmose III marched his army from Thebes to Megiddo and northern Canaan, prudently choosing a narrow pass from the town of Aruna instead of the wider and easier routes to the city. He surprised his enemies by entering the Nile Valley behind their defensive positions and driving them from the field. Thutmose III had to lay siege to the city to seize it. Geneti, who was through most of the third's commander and military scribe, naturally accompanied his monarch in war to put down the rebellion and wrote a record describing the fight. Thutmose III was so taken by Geneti's tale that he had sections of it written on the walls of the great temple of Amun at Karnak and to a lesser extent elsewhere. Geneti begins by describing whether writing on the temple walls exists. He then goes on to explain the campaign and its motivations. The wretched adversary, referenced on several occasions, is the king of Kadesh, who started the revolt and gathered the armies against Egypt. It is also used to refer to everyone who joined the rebellion. Following the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose III would subdue and punish those who took part. They captured not just Kadesh, but also all of Syria and the Mitanni territories and Mesopotamia. He was succeeded by his son, Amenhotep II, who inherited and built on his father's powerful and safe kingdom. He was not a warrior king, but he did order many construction projects and signed peace treaties and commerce deals with other countries. His son, Amenhotep II, 1425–1400 BCE, inherited and built on his father's powerful and safe kingdom. Stay tuned for the sequel.